Hey, all right, Shanna, thank you so much for being here today on the My Sleeping Baby podcast. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. I'm Shanna Alvarez, and I am a child psychologist. And my partner is Jenna Elgin. She's not here today due to childcare eruptions everywhere. But we actually met in graduate school at the University of Washington. We were both getting our doctoral degrees in psychology, and just ended up being the two that would partner up together for most projects. And we both worked as research scientists for years, doing research on long-term outcomes for children with various developmental differences, and also looking at the impact of early childhood experiences in long-term outcomes for kids. And so we were always passionate about research together throughout that career in school. And then when we graduated, we were still really committed to evidence-based practice, meaning, how do we get rigorously studied information that has been found to be effective out to the families that we're serving? And we did that via a lot of programs, but we led Incredible Years groups, which is an evidence-based parenting intervention, together for years, and have just always been really passionate about that work, about supporting families, right? Not just a checklist of activities for the kids specifically, but wrapping around an entire family and making sure that parents are also okay. Parents have to be okay for kids to be okay. So that's what we've been doing in clinical work. We supervise students from the University of Washington, training doctoral students, and loved it. We also became parents at around the same time through various journeys into parenthood. I've been a foster mom, biological mom, adoptive mom, every type of journey into becoming a mom. And Jenna also has 3 children, as do I. And as we, supported each other through our personal journeys into parenthood, we got to see a lot of misinformation out there. And that became a frequent bonding exercise for us, was discussing this disturbing gap between what we knew was effective and grounded science-based information from our training and from all of our years in clinical practice, and then what we were seeing out in social media now that we were actually part of the social media world after Jenna dragged me kicking and screaming into it, and would send me screenshots going, "Ooh, what is this?" And I was like, "Oh, that's not consistent with what we know." And at the same time, I'm in clinic seeing more and more this trend of really anxious, overwhelmed parents that I didn't fully appreciate why until I dipped into social media a bit myself, and started to realize, oh my gosh, they are hearing lots of different perspectives that often contradict each other. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. So that became kind of a second branch of our work, was this dedication to getting evidence-based information out to the everyday parent, essentially. Then COVID happened.
Yes. And that.
The small thing of a global pandemic. And when COVID happened, an interesting thing happened in practice, in my clinical work, which is that all of a sudden a lot more families who had kind of known maybe they were struggling before, and their kid, struggled with their emotions. Well, now they were home with their kids full time.
And then it was unbearable.
It was unbearable. And also I kind of became more accessible. All of a sudden, you don't have to leave your office, and you can open up your laptop and get therapy and get help, which I actually hadn't thought about when it first started. So that's been beautiful, but also wait lists have been a real thing. So we wanted to put together evidence-based information collectively into online learning platform for parents that just needed evidence-based information during this crazy time. So that's how we created our course, Essentials of Parenting. And we looked at these only the top 4 evidence-based parenting interventions, and said, okay, we're trained in these. What are the common core components of only things that have been rigorously studied, so that parents could have in one place, understand what the actual science is and how to use these tools. So that was our COVID passion project, was making this for families to have access to that information. And I'll give you a discount code for your families. So if they are wanting that type of information, they can access that.
I think I want that kind of information as well, as a mom of 3 who's also still living in this pandemic. So that sounds like a fantastic offer for all of us, myself included.
It's something I revisit it often. And every time I'm doing therapy with clients, I will often be like, oh yeah, I need to revisit that. We're always sharpening our skills, right?
Yeah,
Every
I'm sure.
parent needs to revisit that information. So
I'm so curious. So, before we delve into sleep and attachment specifically, you piqued my interest here because you mentioned that when you and Jenna began doing your work and you were seeing what was happening on social media, that you saw certain themes or messages being told to moms that made you go, where in the hell is this coming from? So can you share maybe some of those messages that, I guess, if you could scream from the rooftops and say, no, that's not true, what would some of them be? Just give us a couple.
Oh Lord. All right. Here we go. Let me start broad and then I'll give you some specific examples.
Okay, sure.
Okay, about how all of this is happening. What's happening is that science doesn't sell. And science doesn't sell because science is nuanced, and that's boring and hard to capture in a certain amount of characters on Instagram. And because it's often so nuanced that it doesn't elicit a whole lot of fear or shame, which is what ultimately draws people to buy a product, right? Right. So there's lots of evidence-based tools out there that have been rigorously studied that have 100 followers on Instagram because they're in the universities and they're working with families that are in crisis and in the clinic, right?
Yeah.
So as a result, what we see happening a lot is that there might be something that is based in some type of information out there, maybe that started in science, but it's become an oversimplified game of telephone. Okay. So there might be a research finding, let's say in rats, that says wow, when, I don't know, I'm giving a random example. This is not an actual study, but to illustrate, when you leave rats alone for 5 minutes, their stress hormones go up, right? So, interesting, like, oh, let's think about that. And then what might come out, in social media and popular media the next day is something like, leaving your child alone and giving them space, or sleep training, insert whatever parenting practice you want to villainize here, sleep training, timeout, I don't know, insert anything there, is damaging and is child abuse, akin to child abuse. Okay. So it's this oversimplification that happens a lot, not because I think people are malicious, but because it's a lot of nuance to capture in this particular modality, right? So the things that we want to correct, broadly speaking, that we want to stand and shout from the rooftops are, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
It is nuanced. There are many paths up this mountain. That doesn't mean anything goes. Okay. So there is evidence that we're trying to disperse, that a lot of people are dedicated to disseminating, not just us, right? Our mentors in the parent research world are trying to disseminate as well. That tell us kind of what the pillars are, that say, like, we talk about due north, that give you your compass, right? Like, here's the parenting mountain. Here's what we know really has been shown to damage kids. Here's what we know has been shown to be really helpful for kids and for parents. This has been rigorously studied. Follow these general guidelines, okay? And you're going to end up north. Now, the person next to you might take this path. The other person might take this path, formula feed, breastfeed, co-sleep, sleep train, time out, time in, right? There's lots of paths up the mountain. So long as you're going due north, right? And you're heading this way. So you could be going due north, right, up this mountain, and have different specific parenting practices, okay?
Right.
But what's important is that we don't shame each other for that, right? And we're going to get into this, I know, because very anxious parenting, right, or parents that become very anxious because of the level of misinformation that they feel paralyzed by, impacts mental health. And parent mental health is very well established that impacts your kids' outcomes.
Right.
So it's irresponsible. It is irresponsible to fearmonger and shame parents. That's what I want to shout from the rooftops, right?
Yeah.
Shaming parents for not being on this particular path or parenting trend or parenting philosophy, and closing our eyes to the fact that there are cultures throughout the world that do things differently than this one particular group that might have the loudspeaker on social media. And they turn out with kids that have secure attachment and healthy outcomes.
Yeah.
Right? That is irresponsible to suggest that there is a one size fits all. We have to have some containers, of course, evidence-based practice, of course, but there's more nuance and more wiggle room in there than I think a lot of parents are being led to believe.
I love that. No, I think that that's so important because you're right. I'm listen, I'm on social media all the time and I do see that messaging constantly that, you have to do things this way. And if you don't, you're going to damage your child and then they're going to have lifelong trauma and don't do that. And that's a lot of pressure to put on someone to do things exactly the way that you're telling them to do. And you're saying it's not even evidence-based. Like it's
Right.
not even, it's just their opinion.
So what we'll see sometimes is people with, and I've seen a little bit of this pushback, which I think is great. People popping in comments and saying like, could you give us the citation? Meaning like, could you provide the research article that supports this claim that you're making?
Mhm.
And what people will do is they'll link to an article that maybe is an opinion piece, or like I was talking about with that example earlier with rats, right? Like when you
Yeah.
actually look at the article that's being referenced, and we can dive in this today when we talk about sleep research and when we talk about
Yeah.
attachment. But what's being used as this foundation or this, the rationale behind these claims often isn't even directly related to the claim being made. So there's
Yeah.
different levels of evidence that can be provided, right?
Right.
So that's the trickiest part. And where do I see the most misinformation right now? I would say the trend that I've seen in the last 10 years is that I see a lot more anxious parents that feel like if they are not purely positive and responsive all the time in every moment, that their kids are not going to be okay. And
Yeah.
as a result, we see a lot of anxiety, paralysis, and either as a result of that, not setting boundaries, or as a result of that, trying so hard to be positive and perfect that they explode at their kids.
Yeah.
I see a lot of stuff out there about be really positive, be really coaching, don't do this, it'll damage your kid, don't do that. And then, the next day I will see a post from similar groups talking about, did you lose your shit at your kid again? Have you exploded? Here's how to repair.
Right.
And I'm kind of going, well, maybe if we balanced a little bit, we
Yeah.
wouldn't see this swinging of extremes where
Right.
you're trying to constantly be positive and then always in damage control mode because it's just not real.
Yes. Right. And it's not necessary to have to be. It's not necessary. It's not realistic. And we're allowed to experience emotions that are not positive and happy and, butterflies all the time, just like our kids are. Our kids
Yes.
are allowed, of course, we obviously want to be mindful about how we express those emotions, but to feel frustrated, to feel upset, to feel angry, to feel mad is a normal human way to respond to real life.
Right.
And you're right. And I think that there is this massive emphasis on suppressing that and to just have everything constantly be, butterflies and rainbows. And maybe it is the pendulum swinging to like the opposite end of the spectrum, where many of us may have grown up where, being spanked and being, being sent up to our rooms all the time and in a very authoritarian type of way. And so that's what I can't help but wonder. Like maybe it's the response to that, which is swinging the pendulum too far to the other end of the spectrum, right?
That's exactly what we talk about in our course, is kind of dissecting where this comes from. And that's where I
Yeah.
want to, in my feistiness, I want to make sure that I'm also sharing this compassion, right? In that I work with a lot of parents who have been through trauma themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So they grew up with a traumatic, harsh experience.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing will bring up your shit about your childhood more than raising your own kid.
Yeah.
And sometimes your response to that pain when you were little is to say, I'm never going to do that to my kid.
Yes.
Which is amazing. You are going to change it, which we can. We can interrupt those cycles of harsh parenting and abuse and all of these things. There is power to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But then what can happen is you can have a trauma response to seeing your kid experience any level of distress.
Yeah.
And have that send this message in you of like, oh, I'm damaging my kid. I'm abusing my kid. Oh no, I'm repeating the cycle.
Yes.
Really, that's not what it is, right? That's not what it is. And so it comes from love, and it is hard to find balance in this.
Yes.
It is really, really hard to do, but there are ways to do it. And fear mongering and shame is not the way.
Nope. And I'm sure that sleep is probably also one of those I just say the word sleep and it makes you just lose it, right? Because I can only imagine, you know, you and Jenna both being so knowledgeable and so qualified, and you know, you've looked at the research, you've studied it, you dissect it, and then you see these like funny, cute, you know, one-line memes talking about sleep that doesn't have like the least amount of evidence to back it up. I mean, it probably makes you want to lose your mind as well, right?
Well, you know, what's interesting is it doesn't make me lose my mind when people have opinions and then other like-minded people share that opinion and it works for them and they're celebrating that. And they're like, you know, it's awesome. Like my kid has never needed a timeout. This timing works really well for my kid. Or when they say like, oh my gosh, I love co-sleeping. Like it's worked so well. It's really helped me feel attached to my kid, or I love breastfeeding, or I love bottle feeding. That's great. That makes me happy because connection as human beings is so important, right? But when we divide into camps to villainize each other, that is not okay with me because that impacts parent mental health. And then the psychologists are dealing with, you know, the damage control of all these parents that are not okay as a result of that. So empowerment is the name of the game here, right? Like, how do we get this information to people so that then they can find what works for their family? You don't want to sleep train. You don't want to bottle feed. You don't want to breastfeed. Great. Here's some information so that you can make an empowered decision so your family will be okay.
Yes. So let's dive into this more, because I tell you, I have so many people who email me, DM me, call me, you know, reach out for help. And with the following scenario, their baby, their toddler, their preschooler is not sleeping consistently through the night. They're waking up multiple times. They take forever to fall asleep. They nap for 20 minutes, you know, something, it's whatever, and nobody is sleeping. And, you know, it's usually the mom reaching out to me. The mom is a disaster. She's not waking up refreshed. She feels like she got hit by a truck on a day-to-day basis. She knows that this is not working, but she is afraid that any kind of sleep training is going to rupture her little one's healthy attachment. So before we, you know, I guess delve into that, like, let's just kind of address, you know, the broader question here first. What exactly is healthy attachment, and what does it look like when you have healthy attachment with a baby or a young child?
Yeah. Okay. So this is similar, right? This is drawing out the need for us to separate what is, you know, kind of popular media messaging about maybe attachment parenting versus what is evidence-based, you know, rigorously studied science of attachment science. And attachment science and attachment parenting are not the same thing, which is tricky because they are so similarly named. And attachment parenting actually didn't used to be called attachment parenting. It was called creative parenting when it's
really. I did not know that.
And then, but it was right around the time that attachment science was really, some foundational work was happening there, and the name shifted to attachment parenting. So let's just more clearly delineate those terms to give some background knowledge. Okay, so attachment parenting was kind of coined by this pediatrician, Dr. William Sears. And attachment science is Dr. Ainsworth and Bowlby. Okay, so just to separate the names, they never worked together. Their work is not related at all. Okay, Ainsworth and Bowlby were researchers, and Dr. William Sears was a pediatrician, a general pediatrician. Okay, so his work in the 90s was really about this claim that we could immunize, and he actually uses that word, immunize children against these social and emotional diseases that plague our society, and that we could do that through the prevention of crime predominantly. Okay, so that was a big part. Prevention of crying, and doing that through maximizing parent empathy and responsiveness, okay, and continuous bodily closeness and touch. Okay, so he came up with these behaviors, he and his wife, that he believed could support this idea, none of which have been studied as a program ever. Okay, so
there are no studies
of
on the effect of attachment parenting practices on attachment.
There are studies of individual practices, very limited. For example, baby wearing, right, has been associated with reduced crying in kiddos.
Okay.
There are no studies saying that people that practice attachment parenting have children that are more securely attached than others. Now, that is not to say that there's anything wrong with attachment parenting. It absolutely, these 7 behaviors that he came up with feel like a great fit for many families, right? They're birth bonding, breastfeeding, baby wearing, bedding close to baby, the belief in the language value of crying. He wanted them all to start with B's, right? Beware of baby trainers. That's the 6th B. And 7, which is interesting, is balance. So those are the 7 B's. And the aim of those 7 B's was to prevent crying at all costs, right? Now, there are 0 peer-reviewed studies on combining these 7 practices at all. It's actually not even an intervention. It is not a program. It's a philosophy, right? And it's a philosophy that brings a lot of families great joy, right? Now, the problem is that sometimes this philosophy that may or may not bring joy is confused with attachment science, okay? So totally different. And this is about attachment science is all about what does the research say about how to have healthy attachment with your kiddo? And that has actually been studied. Okay, so now we're in, I feel like I'm lecturing in one of my classes. Okay.
Yeah, no. This is fantastic.
Is this okay? All right.
Yeah.
So Bowlby's interest in this topic was really related to his own history of being separated from his family. He was sent to a boarding school as a young child during wartime. Okay. And so as an adult, he became really interested in the impact in separation between caregivers and children and that impact on kids long-term. Okay. And then Ainsworth did a lot of work in Uganda, kind of studying the relationship between mothers and their infants. Okay. So there's a whole lot of work there that's fascinating, but I'll bring it down. Her work in Uganda was basically this observation that infants would use their moms as what's termed as a secure base, right? So that means something they can return back to in periods of distress, right? And go back out and explore. Now, this is an interesting thing because the notion of secure base, which is part of healthy attachment, involves 2 things: being able to come in and check in, and then the part that gets overlooked, being able to separate and explore.
Yeah.
Right? So it involves both, which sometimes I think isn't fully captured in this oversimplified version where, healthy attachment is pictured as always here and not separating. Okay.
Right.
All right. So then when they observed these dyads, these mothers and their infants in Uganda, they kind of tried to replicate, how do we study this more in the US, which is a very different culture. And they did that through this experiment that ultimately is called the strange situation. And this is a lab experiment in which essentially, a caregiver and a baby come in and play, and there's an initial observation period. And they're observing the kid's behavior to look at what's called temperament, right? Kids come into the world with their own flavors, right? We don't have ultimate control, right? If you're a parent of multiples, you know this, right? You can have one. My youngest points to bed when she's ready to sleep. She's hungry at the same time every day. She's pretty laid back. My other 2, not so much, right? So they come in with their own flavors. And that's what they would initially observe, right? Their temperament. Then a stranger is introduced to the room, kind of sits in the corner there. And we look at, how does the baby respond to the introduction of that stranger? And then the caregiver actually says goodbye and leaves. And so now the stranger is with that baby. Okay. Now, a lot of people think like, oh, that separation is what matters. That shows if they have a healthy attachment or not. Actually, no. That tends to have more to do with temperament, your kid's kind of baby personality, right? But it doesn't have to do with their relationship with you as their parent or their caregiver. Okay. But then the reunion. So when that caregiver comes back in the room, that's the juicy part. Yeah. That's the part where we kind of look at, is a baby able to return to their baseline. So whatever change there might have been in their typical, how they were expressing their personality, how they were behaving in when they were left alone with a stranger, are they able to come back down to their baseline, which can be different for every kid, right? Coming back to this observation, Uganda, right? This idea of safe base, right? Secure.
So
base.
in other words, like mom comes back into the room, are they able to be calmed and soothed by mom coming back in?
Yeah, calmed and soothed, return to exploring their environment, right? How do they use the adult as a resource to soothe and calm down? Because as an adult, you become your own secure base, right? You're able to bring yourself down. And as a child, they do that with the adults in their environment.
Okay.
And, you know, basically they observed all this and they found different patterns, and that kids could have secure attachments or insecure attachments. And the kids that had the best and healthiest outcomes socially and emotionally were babies with secure attachment, which means that they were able to regulate, go back to exploring their environment, feel soothed once their mom ultimately, or their caregiver rather, did return. Now, this is defined by, you know, a variety of behaviors, but the insecure babies, there's lots of different ways that a child might have insecure attachment. But essentially, they didn't use that base as effectively, right? So that wasn't able to get them to return back to baseline.
So what did that look like? So with the babies with healthy attachment, mom comes back in, they maybe cry for a few minutes, they calm down, they go back to playing with mom, right? You know, mom present, you know, in some way, shape, or form. What did that look like for the babies that did not have a secure attachment?
Yeah. So one way that can look is what's called resistant babies, where they might have they would go towards at the reunion, but then have this kind of mixed response to it. It sometimes can also be referred to as disorganized attachment, where you want to approach, but you also stay away, right? So it's like you're agitated, you're resisting soothing. And then, you know, the least common is avoidant type, where at the reunification, this child might not even go to the parent at all, or, you know, just doesn't seem to respond whatsoever.
Like now, is indifferent to the parent coming back in? Okay.
So I want to be careful here, because Jenna and I have all this information, and we still will go into an anxiety pit once in a while and be like, oh my gosh, you know, my baby is insecurely attached, or my baby is, you know, and we do this with all topics, right? Because information can be awesome and it can be awful. Yeah. This is a very precise and nuanced science coding these behaviors. Yeah. So because of temperament differences, not every baby needs to, has to, should crawl right up to their caregiver and be like, mommy. That is not what is necessary for healthy attachment, right? Okay. So some babies might kind of look over and check in and be like, oh, mom's there, and then keep playing, and then look back over and check in. And that is their way of using you as their base. Yeah. And they're good. And they're good. Other kids might go over and get a little clingy and then go out and explore. So there's some variation there. And again, variation is okay, right? Yes.
But the overarching theme here is that the baby is calmed by the mom's returning, you know, whether they're super excited to see mom and they're just like, oh, hey, what's up, mom? Okay, I'm going to go back to playing now. Or, you know, simply just acknowledging like, all right, mom's here. Fantastic. That's the most, so like not being completely indifferent. That's the most important thing. Okay.
And not seeing this disorganized response where, you know, I'm a foster mom, and sometimes when you go to soothe a child, they might try to hit you. Right? But they also want you. Yeah. They want you and they don't want you at the same time. Right. And that's some attachment experience that has been really hard for them, right? Like, am I safe? Do I push this away? Is this going to soothe me, or is this going to hurt me? Right. Type of experience, right? So that kind of disorganization would be right. You know, what we're looking for there. But so then, go on. Important part to point out. When you look at this situation across various cultures across the world, most babies are securely attached.
Really?
Right? Yes. Most babies are securely attached. So given all the difference in cultures and all the differences in parenting practices, this is where I do want everybody to exhale just a little bit. Again, not to say, and this depends on the audience we're talking to, right? Yeah. when I'm working in communities in which there's a lot of physical discipline, a lot of physical violence, a lot of aggression, then we have to do some work to say like, hey, actually attachment is really important. Here's what these practices, or here's what, neglecting your baby in a really impactful way, right? Neglecting your baby. Neglect and not responding every moment of the day are two different things, okay? I'm going to emphasize that with that population. When I'm working with a parent who is responsive most of the time, right? Which when we look at secure attachment, the best it gets is 50 to 70% responsiveness. The most securely attached babies, that's what their parents do.
Yeah.
Okay. So nobody's rocking this because it's impossible. And the attempt to be perfect is going to really mess with you.
Right.
So
So then where does this, how do you respond when you hear people talk about how attachment is established through proximity? I hear that a lot in the attachment parenting world. Is there any sliver of truth behind that? Or is that just merely an opinion of the attachment parenting world that isn't actually backed up by any science?
yeah, so there are, like I said before, there are limited individual studies of specific behaviors such as baby wearing, right? So for example, I know my youngest had reflux and was a bit colicky, right? And I wore her for everything,
Right.
whereas I didn't with my other two, right?
Yeah.
And lots of parents might find that is helpful for reducing crying. Now, are there great studies of exactly why that reduces crying? Is it related to some babies being colicky or having digestive issues? Is it related to the comfort of the parent? We don't know. And that's the truth of it, is we don't know. What we can say is there is not one study showing that if you do not use these 7 B's of attachment parenting, that your child will have any difference in attachment incomes whatsoever.
Yeah.
Any difference whatsoever.
Right.
Okay.
Right. But you see, I think that there is so much guilt around sleep training when people hear that sort of message, because maybe they're in a scenario where, their baby or their toddler is co-sleeping with them, not out of choice, out of desperation. It was, a reactive parenting choice. It was the best way that they could get some sleep, but they don't like it. They want baby in his crib, but then they hear attachment is established through proximity, and then it makes the parent go, do I have to sacrifice attachment in the name of being able to get a proper night's sleep? You know what I mean? So let's dive into this in detail, because I'm sure in your practice and in your parenting courses, you have parents asking you these sorts of questions. I want to be able to sleep train, but I think another message that I hear a lot is that when you are doing any form of sleep training and your baby or your toddler is crying and you're not giving them what they want at that moment, whether it be they want you to feed them to sleep, they want to be rocked to sleep, they want to come into your bed, then it must mean that you're teaching them that they can't rely on you. And so when they learn how to sleep properly at night, it's because they've learned that you're not there for them.
Right.
That's heavy stuff. So I would love for you to unpack this, because it weighs on a lot of people and it eats at people's heartstrings when they desperately want to be sleeping, but then they're hearing this type of messaging.
Yeah. Okay, I want to dive into where that claim comes from. Okay,
yeah, so take it away.
Let's dive into that specific study. And before as a jumping off point, I want to note, just as a fun addition here, that earlier we talked about the 7 B's and Dr. Sears and everything. I encourage you to look at Dr. Sears' more updated perspectives on sleep training, because he actually changed his tune over the years.
Really?
Yeah, he softened quite a bit. He got more nuanced. Imagine that.
Has he come up with a new version of his book?
Oh, that would be interesting to know. I don't know.
I wonder I would love to see his updated stuff.
I've just listened to a couple of interviews that are far more nuanced than what the initial work would lead us to believe. So people evolve over time, but let's dive in. I think the most common study that's cited here is the Middlemiss study. Do you know this study? The cortisol study. It's all about stress hormones, basically. So let's talk about where this comes from. All right. So This study was on 25 babies, okay, by a researcher named Middlemiss at the University of North Texas, okay, in the College of Education. And this, let's separate what the study found versus what has been heard in popular media about it. So something you might hear in popular media is, well, the researchers found that high levels of stress hormones, which is cortisol, right, in mothers and babies during sleep training, after several days, once the babies had learned to go to sleep without crying, on those quiet nights, the mom's cortisol had gone down, but the babies were up, right? So the babies had learned to be quiet, even though their cortisol levels were still really high on day 3 of sleep training. Okay, so the fact that they're quiet actually means that, this is the interpretation, this is not what I'm saying, okay? The fact that they're quiet means that these babies have learned to suffer in silence. Okay, that's the interpretation. All right, so now let's look at that. So to look at this design, there were these 25 mom and infant pairs, okay? They were enrolled in a sleep training program, and in this particular sleep training program, it was just complete extinction, which means you just simply do not respond. There's no, coming and checking, there's nothing. You just let them pure cry it out, as it's often referred to, okay? Which is neither here nor there, I just wanna bring that up, okay? And this was done at a hospital, not in a home setting, okay? So this was at a hospital. And the babies were 4 to 10 months old, I think. And when it was time for bedtime, the moms helped their babies get ready, but then a nurse was the one to put them down to bed while the mom went out into the hallway. So the mom could still hear the babies cry, okay? But the babies couldn't see the moms, and they just let them cry until they fell asleep without any soothing, okay? And that repeated for 4 days. So let's point out some key things here. Hospital setting, nurse puts baby down, 4 days, pure cry it out, okay? Got it? All right. So then what do they do? So on the first night and the third night, they measured cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So how much stress hormone was in the mom's body and how much stress hormone was in the baby's body. Follow me? Got that? Okay. So when you don't collect data at the beginning, baseline data, we don't know what cortisol levels were before this even started. Okay. Also, we don't know if these other variables we talked about impacted cortisol. I'm in a hospital, there's somebody I've never met before putting me to sleep, right? There's a lot of things happening too, okay? So there's no baseline levels. We don't know where this idea that, when the cortisol levels were described as high in the study, what does high mean?
Yeah, in relative to what?
Relative to what?
Right.
Right, exactly, right? And this is common too, cortisol, not just in sleep research, but, it's been villainized in a lot of ways, right? That cortisol is the enemy and our goal is to always keep it down. And that's a whole nother line of research, about stress and resilience and such, that claim just isn't true, right? So we have to be careful about interpreting this. Okay, so she calls them high. We don't know relative to what, but those levels stayed pretty steady throughout the study. Okay. Now, interestingly, when the author was approached about this, she said, "Well, I did collect baseline data, but I didn't report it." Oops. So that's also a little bit, as a researcher, it's a little bit baffling, right? So we're starting to see okay, there's some interesting stuff that happened. This is not to say this is not interesting data, right? It's interesting data, but holy game of telephone, right?
Yeah.
Second, there's some really big statistical math problems with the study. She looked at the average level of cortisol for the whole group.
No control
right? Instead of looking at what was happening for each kiddo. Okay. Yeah. And that, it's in the statistical analysis world, that's a big no.
No, that's a problem.
In addition, there's no control group. A control group means we're comparing this. So let's take a group of kids that had sleep training versus a group of kids that were co-sleeping in a hospital room.
Yes. Because that's going to make a difference.
That's going to make
that's I mean, as a mom, when I hear about a bunch of babies being sleep trained in a hospital, I'm going, well, of course their cortisol levels are going to go up. They're in a hospital, they're not at home, and it's a nurse putting them to bed, not mom.
Well, and even there, you know, we have to be careful about saying their cortisol levels are going to go up. Because
We
when
don't
we
know.
know that they went up, we know
There's
that they were
so much
labeled as
we
high.
don't there's so much we don't know about this. And I just want to emphasize, I mean, I am not a researcher myself, but in like my previous lifetime, I worked as a lawyer in a research hospital here in Toronto. And I was responsible for negotiating the hospital's clinical trial agreements. And so I was on the phone with, you know, doctors and researchers daily about all their research going on. I would sit in on like research ethics board meetings. And so while I'm not the scientist, I'm not the researcher, I'm very, very familiar with like what a good study looks like, what a blinded study looks like, what a double blinded study looks like. And this matters. This really, really matters. There is such thing as really good quality research. And then there is junky research that really doesn't prove enough in the grand scheme of things to be able to post a big headline of a conclusion.
Well, and this is where pride can really get the best of all of us, right? We all need pride checks from time to time, right? There's a difference between an interesting study, right? Like, I don't even want to say, you know, trashy research or throw. It's interesting.
It's beginning research. Maybe sorry, I shouldn't have said garbage. It's more like it's the beginning stages. Yes. And you know what they usually say is more research needs to be done. That's what they'll say at the very end of the conclusion. More research needs to be done on XYZ, you know, whatever it is. And that, of course, is the scientist being humble and acknowledging that there are a huge amount of limitations as to what we've looked at. But hey, you know what? This is the start of some really interesting research on cortisol levels, you know, in babies, but we need to do much more because of all those limitations that you just mentioned.
Right. Exactly. And, you know, by the end of the study, I think only 14, it was about half of the kids, half of the infants, only half of their data could be included for various reasons. So it ends up being this tiny study.
Right.
Which again is enough for interesting, you know, researchers cocktail hour and, you know, talking about this interesting small finding. It's really cool jumping off point. But for research to be the basis for a practice, right? It needs to have had a control group. Yeah. It needs to be quite large to be considered powerful. It needs to be replicated, meaning that different groups other than the original researcher have been able to find the same thing in the same conditions. Okay, which has never been done. Okay, it needs to be shown across different cultures and situations, also never been done. Right, so there's a lot of concern here that people have really jumped with this. Now, there's limited research, but there actually is a quality study that has a lot of those components. And I think it was, hang on, I have to look here because I wanted to have the citation.
The Australian one?
Which one?
The Australian study?
The Gradisar study?
I don't know. I'm not holding those details. I just know it was done in Australia.
Okay, no, I actually don't know. But in 2016, there was a great study it's called Randomized Controlled Trial. It's getting really nerdy for a second, but already that's like, oh, okay, that means there was a control group, a comparison group, right? Yeah. And that means that they were randomly told, like, you're getting sleep training, you're not, you're right. Yeah. This study was still somewhat small, 43 infants, right? But the study design was far more solid, right? Far more solid. And they used what's called graduated extinction. You're a sleep person, you probably know. Yeah. So a different response within homes. And let's just come to say that this study that had far stronger design found no differences in attachment styles between the sleep trained group and the not sleep trained group. Yeah. Yeah. No differences at all in the short term or in the long term. Yeah. Okay. So, you know, the control group and the one that was getting sleep training, no adverse stress response, meaning cortisol levels were found. So that contradicts what was found before. Okay. No long-term effects on parent-child attachment. And no long-term effects or short-term, neither. I say long-term because sometimes people are like, yeah, but when they're 40, they're going to have abusive relationships because you sleep train. Right. No. No. No, none of that was found, right? Right. So what do we know? So there's one study that has some interesting data that had a lot of flaws that made us curious about cortisol.
Yeah.
That in no way would lead us to say that sleep training impacts attachment whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then we have a much stronger study design that shows that there's not a difference in terms of child outcomes, parent-child relationship, or stress levels in parent or child. So what does that mean? Sounds like parents have some choices here.
Yes.
It sounds like parents can be empowered with that information.
Yes. Yes.
And what they could do with that information is say, well, okay, what does have more research behind it? You know what has a lot of research? Depressed and anxious parents tend not to bond with their kids as well.
Oh my gosh, that's huge.
That has a ton of research behind it. I could give you a whole bunch of great study designs about that. You know what else has a ton of research? That sleep deprivation really is associated with maternal depression and even maternal psychosis. Right? The first treatment for maternal psychosis is sleep. It's not meds. It's sleep. That is the first prescription that is made.
Yeah.
So if you're doing great and sleep training feels weird to you and you're like, oh, I can't imagine being away from my baby like this, awesome. You could have a secure attachment with your baby. And if that's not the case for you, awesome. You can have a secure attachment with your baby. Learn to be responsive, learn to regulate your own emotions. We could have a whole nother podcast on what you can do, to have a healthy relationship with your kid. But you're not going to mess up your kid by doing what works for you in terms of sleep.
Yes. And I also heard that there were some other studies that, where the conclusions around attachment and children, where some of those conclusions were taken to substantiate anti-sleep training philosophies, namely that if a child experiences long-term childhood stress, that can impact attachment. And then from there, it was implied that, well, sleep training is the equivalent of your child experiencing long-term childhood stress. And it's no different. I've as a parent, I heard that messaging a lot. And so I'm wondering if, you're familiar with that research and those studies and where that all comes from.
Yeah. So this brings us back to the stress research, which has some in why can't I think of the word in English? I'm thinking in Spanish. In common, in common with attachment research. So essentially, there's this idea of toxic stress, which is real. Okay. I'm a foster parent. I'm a foster care advocate in Washington State. And I also work with kids that have gone through substantial trauma. And a lot of attachment research, as we talked about before, wartime separation, a lot of that research is based on families in really hard situations.
Yeah.
Okay. Trauma is real, right? We're talking about people growing up around gun violence daily. We're talking about people witnessing domestic violence. We're talking about people who cannot attend, not that they're taking space for themselves for a moment to regulate, right? We're talking about parents that cannot attend to their kids because they have to leave their child alone to go to work, or they have to go, they have to leave to, attend to other things, and there's no one to watch their child and they are leaving them unsupervised, right? We're talking about kids separated due to parental death and wartime. Okay.
Yeah.
This is what these initial studies are based on.
Yeah.
Okay. Stress is real. Toxic cortisol levels, the impact of trauma is huge. Okay? But not all stress is the same, and not all people respond to stress the same. So there is actually such a thing as positive stress. There's a great visual out there, but you have toxic stress, which is basically defined as it comes down to high levels of repeated stress over time in the absence of a secure attachment. Okay. A warm, reliable relationship with a caregiver. It doesn't even have to be a parent. Okay. And then, positive stress, in the absence of positive stress is going to be when you have moderate levels of stress in the presence, and presence doesn't have to mean touching. In presence means that you have someone. This could be a teacher, right? Someone's got your back.
Yeah.
Of a loving, secure attachment with a person in your life. Okay. And that's actually an important type of stress to experience. Now, does that mean that, if you don't let your baby cry, or if you're an attachment parent, you're not you're overprotect. No, we're not shaming anybody on either side. We're saying that trauma research can't be weaponized to shame parents into thinking that if they have a different approach to responding to their children's cries, particularly, you know, for sleep or to maintain their own mental health, that's okay. You're not going to damage your kid. That is not the same as wartime separation, exposure to chronic yelling and conflict, domestic violence, poverty, and equating the two, frankly, is a pretty privileged stance.
Yeah. No, and I'm so happy that you explicitly said that, because I have parents that will say to me, and okay, Eva, are you sure that this is not going to ruin my kid for life? Because I heard and I read, XYZ. And so you're explicitly saying, like, yes, healthy attachment can be ruptured in these specific, various, extreme, awful, heart-wrenching situations. Sleep training does not fall into that category.
Say here, of course, my response is to be more nuanced because I'm all about the nuance.
No,
okay?
100%. I'm trying to generalize and simplify.
No, again,
here.
What I would say is that if you engage in sleep safe practices, right, which means you have to be safe when you co-sleep, right? There are things you have to be careful of there, and you have to be safe when you sleep train, right? So, leaving the house for a night and not monitoring your kid so that your child can soothe them, that's not sleep training, right? But if somebody wants to make that claim, of course that's not okay, right? But a safe sleep training program, meaning that you are doing it, in a planned and thoughtful way, and a safe co-sleeping program can both lead to healthy attachment. Neither one of those choices is going to make your attachment. So you could co-sleep and do all the 7 Bs and not necessarily have a secure attachment.
Mm-hmm.
You can never sleep train and not necessarily have a secure attachment.
Yeah.
And it's not going to break your attachment.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to leave people with.
Yes.
That choice in itself is not what attachment is about at all.
Mm-hmm.
Ainsworth and Bowlby didn't research sleep at all.
Right.
And and there are various sleep practices all around the world with kids that have secure attachments.
Yeah.
It's not a one size fits all thing. So you got to make sure you're okay.
Yeah.
That's it.
So just circling back to what you were saying, like, you just got to head north, right? And that's one path that you can take. And there are other paths that you can take. But this path, if you want to take it, will get you north.
Yeah.
It's a perfectly acceptable, safe, realistic plan, that path that you can take if that is what feels right for you.
If you are engaging in evidence-based positive parenting practices, right, which is a whole other thing, right? Yeah. But, meaning that you're responsive and warm to your child most of the time. Remember, 50 to 70% is as good as it gets. You're staying well-regulated most of the time. That doesn't mean happy, sunshine and unicorn, Zen positivity parent 100 times every day. That's okay.
Yes.
If you are doing sleep training in that context or doing co-sleeping in that context,
amazing.
You can absolutely head due north.
Right.
If you find yourself up at night at 11 o'clock scrolling Instagram or whatever, driven by anxiety and fear, that is probably an indication that you need to hit the pause button. And that act in itself is going to determine more about your attachment outcomes.
Yeah.
Than to sleep train or not sleep train.
Mm-hmm.
Anxious perseveration and paralysis and comparison and ruminating, thinking about it over and over again. That is what we need to be more concerned about than whether or not you're going to sleep train.
Mm-hmm. Everybody should just take a big deep breath. Really, like that is the conclusion, right? Like, take a deep breath. You're doing good. You're doing okay. It's not that easy to ruin your kid for life. In other words, like it's not as easy as just a couple days of sleep training and then boom, that's it. It's done. Okay. Shanna, thank you so much for coming on today and delving into this topic in so much more detail because I know how huge it is for everyone. And I know how groundbreaking I think so much of this is going to be for so many people listening. It gives them that permission to do what they want to do, what they need to do for themselves and for their family so badly. So if people want more of you in their lives, where can they find you?
Yes, you can go to our website at helpingfamiliesthrive.com. You can also follow us on Instagram, Helping Families Thrive. I'll give links to the research articles we talked about to you so that that can be available for review. So that I'm, walking the walk here. We're staying consistent with the values. And also we'll give a code for our course if people are wondering, okay, so I'm going to do sleep training. I'm not going to do sleep training. How do I make sure that I'm engaging positive parenting behaviors that are backed by research? Yeah. Then we'll give that code of HFT sleep. So HFT sleep that they can enter for discount on our course as well.
All right. Amazing. That will all be posted in the show notes. Everybody can access that. Amazing. Shanna, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everyone listening. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.